everyone, and welcome to the latest and last of our Best of 2022 podcast. And this time around, it's all about film. And I'm joined once again by Chris Ward and Wesley Shearer. Hello, both.
Hello.
Nice to be here again and chatting about the year in film.
Well, it wouldn't be Christmas without us chatting about films and stuff, I think. That's what I'm going to claim anyway. So like previous times, we've each picked 5 films, with me, film-ish, but 5 films each to talk about. So Chris, as you are to the top left of my screen, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't know. I thought I would have a kind of lead in. I guess I'll just start with my my favorite of the year, which was Benediction, the new film from Terence Davies, who I think is at this point probably one of England's 2 greatest living filmmakers. The only kind of rival I can think of for him is Mike Leigh, and arguably his greatest ever queer director. I can't think of anybody other than maybe Derek Jarman who could rival him at this point. He's maybe like kind of
still alive, just to let you know.
I said England. I clarified England rather than Scotland. Yes, because I knew if I said that, I knew that I'd get picked up for a bill for Forsyth.
Sorry.
So yeah, I know, because if you broadened it to the UK, like Lynn Ramsey's right there as well. Yeah, so yeah, I'm narrowing the field here, but yeah, he traditionally makes these kind of like memory pieces, like his kind of early work, like Distant Voices, Still Lives, Long Day Closes. They're all kind of more or less autobiographical and very warm-hearted, but also very kind of clear-eyed about his upbringing in Liverpool. It doesn't shy away from, kind of the harder side of like his upbringing, domestic abuse, and being like a kind of a gay Catholic boy in the 50s, growing up and with seeing like movies as his outlet and all this kind of stuff, and then in the past decade has kind of moved on more to kind of like literary adaptations. So he did The Deep Blue Sea, the adaptation of the Terence Rattigan play with Rachel Weisz and Tom Hiddleston. He did Sunset Song, of course, with Agnes Dean. And most recently, before this one, did A Quiet Passion, which was a biopic of Emily Dickinson with Cynthia Nixon, which all great, like all consistently brilliant. But this one was something else. So Benediction is kind of, again, a biopic of Siegfried Sassoon, the poet who's obviously best known for his war poetry. And it kind of chronicles his life in 2 separate time periods. So in the first one, it's from round about the midpoint of the First World War, where he's played by Jack Lowden. And then flashes forward throughout the film to his 60s, where he's played by Peter Capaldi. And it chronicles these 2 periods. One in the Capaldi section is around about the time that he converts to Catholicism, and in the kind of earlier Jack Lowden periods, it's the period where he basically decided he wasn't going to fight in the war anymore, and not really a conscientious objector. It is incredibly difficult to say that and enunciate properly. Basically had enough and was going to tell the truth, wasn't going to parrot the kind of honorable deaths kind of line anymore, and was just going to do the kind of unvarnished, this is all these boys are dying senseless deaths, it's a horrible way to die kind of thing. But kind of the film kind of threw me for a loop, because I heard that he was doing like a Sassoon biopic and thought like, oh well, it's going to be largely kind of wartime set, right? And a lot of it's you're going to be in the trenches and all that. There isn't really any, in fact, off the top of my head, I don't know that there is any kind of battle footage. It starts with him being sent to the psychiatric hospital in Edinburgh, where he met Wilfred Owen, basically after saying, being declared it was that or be court-martialed. So he goes there. And the war takes up maybe about half an hour of the film, and then it stops, and the rest of it becomes kind of a chronicle of like basically gay life in the 20s, from the late teens through to the 30s, as he embarks on a succession of unfulfilling, unsatisfying affairs with the likes of like Ivor Novello and like a few socialites along the way as well. And it's just really fascinating. I just thought it was like a really, like, it's a period you don't really see reflected on screen and through that kind of lens that often. Yeah. How these kind of upper class guys, largely like middle to upper class guys, basically, I mean, obviously, like, it would have been difficult for them to be openly gay in a kind of setting like that, but just like basically could live a fairly open life amongst their circle of friends, all these kind of very like indulgent kind of aristocratic women who love them all and all this kind of stuff. And Siegfried Sassoon in the middle of it is this very principled kind of, moralistic would be the wrong word, but a very ethical guy who like just kind of wants to live, his own kind of life and amongst all of this, and not really, is kind of bound by the society at the time, and is very conflicted about a lot of things, and doesn't really feel like he fits in with the more kind of gallivanting, socialite aspects of the scene and all this kind of stuff. And then, yeah, that kind of heartbreak of eventually conforming to like a marriage to save face, which then kind of comes back to haunt him in the kind of later section with Capaldi. It's just a really, really beautifully done film. I think even the way I'm describing it does it isn't doing it justice. It's nowhere near as dry as that makes it sound. It's nowhere near as worthy as that makes it sound. It's very like achingly beautiful and passionate, and just very like sensitively shot and sensitively realized. And I think it's like Davy's most adventurous in terms of like formal filmmaking as well. He's really embracing digital with this, a lot of really innovative ways of like collapsing the two time periods into one another, and like really playing up the kind of digital aspect of digital filmmaking. You know, a lot of like superimpositions and like archive footage, and just everything kind of collapsing in a kind of collage like kind of fashion at times, in transitioning between the two time periods. Yeah, it's staggering. And the fact that I'm so glad that Terence Davies continues to make work, because it looked for a while like throughout the kind of 2000s that he wasn't getting money on a regular basis, you know, but he's had quite a prolific decade, and I hope it kind of continues for as long as we have him, because he's one of the best. He's
proved to be one of the best, and I think proved to be really versatile as well, which after these early films, you kind of thought you knew what a Terence Davies film was. You know, it would be black and white, and you know, it would be about himself and his, you know, youth. And then when he did Sunset Song, I thought, well, how's he going to approach this? And actually, it was fantastic. It was as good or better than I ever expected it to be. And this sounds like another shift.
Yeah, I think yes, but I think the common thread through all of them is like he's fascinated with like kind of outsiders, you know, and people who don't really fit comfortably into the society of their time, whether that's like, I mean, I realized when I was like given the overview of his filmography, I completely elided, like, you know, he did House of Mirth with Gillian Anderson as well, which obviously needed more an adaptation, and it was she, if not completely, you know, about that kind of thing as well. So that seems to be like the through line, is people who don't really feel like they fit into the society that they're, you know, born into, or, you know, they're somehow at odds with it, but not in a kind of subversive way, like a Derek Jarman would or something like this. It's more that kind of like, I guess this is my lot and I'm just going to have to put up with it kind of thing. You know, it's that very resigned, very kind of like, how do I live with myself in this kind of context kind of thing, which again makes it sound absolutely miserable, and it's not. There's so much kind of like warmth and humanity and like depth of feeling to the whole thing. It just absolutely was not what I was expecting from the setup. And yeah, it just really blindsided me. I thought it was absolutely tremendous, really beautiful film.
That's a strong start. Wesley, what are you going to pick first?
Thanks for that, Chris. Yeah. I don't know, actually. I think that sounds really interesting. It's not one that was on my radar at all, so I'm glad you brought it up. Definitely going to check it out. My picks this year are a bit strange. They're probably not all my best, my best or my favourite picks of the year. Just ones I find interesting to talk about. But this first pick definitely is heads and shoulders above everything else my favourite pick of the year, and it's The Worst Person in the World. Now, this came out quite early this year, and I've tried to stay away from a lot of films from earlier in the year just because my memory's not particularly great, but I actually rewatched this 3 times in the cinema. Now, I've not seen it in the cinema actually since probably about April, so it was still a while away, but I've watched it enough that I feel like I can talk about it. A little bit of a hazy memory, but enough that I'll do it justice, hopefully. But it really was, how do I put it, the first big hit for me in 2022. I think most of the films that I'd really held in what seemed at the time like high esteem were, like from the start of the year at least anyway, were more films, maybe Parallel Mothers, The Tragedy of Macbeth, for example, films that really, you know, wowed me at the time, but just didn't really have that staying power or didn't have the kind of urge to rewatch it, unlike this film. And there was some quiet hype around it building up to the release of it, and I didn't really know much about it, didn't really know much about the director. Took a punt and really grabbed a ticket for a preview of it like a month before it was released, and set myself up for a bit of disappointment, didn't know what it was going to be like. And honestly, after finishing watching it, I just hadn't felt like that about the first watch of a film since I saw maybe Phantom Thread or If Beale Street Could Talk. I think are the ones that stand out for me in terms of just wanting to really go back in and watch it and immerse myself in the world and the characters, and try and sort of chase that high of the emotions that I felt the first time I watched it. So going into the film, I did do a bit more deep dive into the director's filmography. The director is called Joachim Trier, if I pronounced that correctly. Hopefully I have. So leading up to it, I watched his first two big feature-length films, which were Reprise, which was about 2006, I think, and then another one in 2011 called Oslo, August 31st.
Mm-hmm.
The Worst Person in the World completes what latterly became sort of loosely defined as the Oslo trilogy.
Right.
And what really links all three films in the trilogy, other than the obvious sense of place of it being set in Oslo, is this really kind of pursuit of, how would I put it, like a sense of freedom maybe, and a sense of fulfillment in a society where success is probably defined for you, and how that the pressures of really navigating that sort of world can impact on an individual's life in whatever way that Joachim Trier decides to explore in each of those three films. So while the first two films focus on stories of men, friendship, like a male lead in the second film, this really centres the experience of a woman, and a woman approaching her 30s. And it's played absolutely brilliantly by Renata Rinsve, who had a really small role in the second film, Oslo, but she takes the lead in this, and it's told through like a series of chapters narrated by her character, Julie. But the character narration is almost like a sort of third voice, or kind of voice of reflection. And then you've got Anders Danielsen Lee, who was the lead in the first two films, returning for a significant but sort of supporting role in this film. And I should also add as well that you don't have to have watched the first two films to watch this. They're completely unrelated in story.
Okay.
Connected loosely in themes. So yeah, it was absolutely brilliant. It's like a really sort of wry, self-deprecating take on the kind of pressures, or the societal pressures at least, that are imposed upon women, I think. And obviously that's not something I can speak to, but it's something that I can see, you know, as quite a big theme in the film. So maybe pressures that will then amplify themselves a bit more when women reach a certain age. So things like the expectations of settling down, falling in love, starting a family, having kids, succeeding in a professional capacity, but maybe in a career that is expected to be a bit more sensible for women. So how do you navigate all of this when you don't know what it is that you want in your life? And how can you do all of this when all you can see ahead of you is like, in the distance, is like time marching towards you? So things like, can you pursue love if you haven't figured out how to love yourself? All of these sort of themes that keep popping up. And what that really does is Trier allows his lead's character to really have some questionable morals at different points throughout the film, and figure out how you rationalize the choices that she makes. And it's just really nice to see something like that, where you've got, you know, a female lead being really morally questionable sometimes in her decision making, and it really allows her to explore these parts of her life in a way that's so messy, so unpredictable, very occasionally destructive. But all of those things, I think, are just like leaving behind a decade of your youth as you transition into a new decade of adulthood that's really uncertain to you. And it does some of the best bits, I think, of the film is when it really drifts into this elements of magical realism that really elevate the concepts of the themes that he's talking about and exploring throughout the film. And it's something that Trier's done before. In his second film, Oslo, there's like a really powerful scene where Danielson Lee's character is sitting in a cafe on his own. And this character is someone who is, you know, and not in a good place, and he's listening to the conversations that people are having around him, really mundane, trivial conversations that really seem like they're completely free of the weight that he's carrying in his life. And then The Worst Person in the World is a sort of flip scene of that, that's really beautiful and magical and uplifting, and really ups the magical realism of everything. And it's when Julie, the lead character, flips a light switch in her kitchen and the whole world stops, completely stops except her. And it's like freeze frame, and she runs through the streets of Oslo as the camera's sweeping and chasing after her, while everything and everyone is absolutely frozen around her. And I won't explain why that's significant in the story, because you should just watch it yourself without, you know, knowing the outcome of it. But it's just so beautifully choreographed. And Trier speaks to, I think, maybe the New York Times about why this isn't how he did it. And he says that he didn't want to make it CG and really easy to do digitally. So they basically shut down all these streets in Oslo that it's filmed on and used extras who were just really good at just standing still and not moving. And he said it was absolutely magical. He said because when people saw in the streets nearby that this was happening, it was just after COVID coming out of lockdowns and stuff. Some other people just started joining in who weren't even extras, who just decided to strike a pose and just stop. And it just really adds to the realism element of it, where the magical stuff's also happening. And it's just so beautiful, and it's one of the standout scenes of the year for me, I think, in cinema in recent years. So I'd really recommend it. It's very modern dilemma that it deals with, and I say that in that I think it's quite a modern idea of being in your 30s is now maybe becoming what your 20s used to be decades ago. So it's only going to probably resonate with a very specific demographic of people more than it will a vastly universal audience. But it seemed to do really well in the sort of indie world anyway, and it got a lot of kind of big coverage, and I just loved it. I will also say that the 3 times I watched it in the cinema, I was pretty tipsy every single time, so I'm yet to watch it sober. So we'll see how that turns out.
Get back to us when you watch it sober.
Yeah, exactly. But I did love it. It was magical, and it's one of the ones that's just stayed with me, and I think it will continue to do so.
That sounds amazing as well. So my first choice is My Old School. So I'm going to try and keep it Scottish related, which was a struggle this year. But My Old School, have either of you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. Well, so do you know that? Well, I'll tell you what it's about. So it's a documentary by John O'Miller, and back in the, I want to say, it might be in the early 90s, I think, there was this big story that happened at Bearsden Academy, that one of the pupils who they thought was 17 turned out to be 32, or that was the thing, and this was a huge thing that blew up. And I remember it well because I was roughly a bit older than that then. So John Joe McLeod, the director, was one of the classmates of the guy who called himself Brandon Lee. He joined the school, I think, 2 weeks after the real Brandon Lee, Bruce Lee's son, had died on the set of The Crow. So even then, classmates are going, really, Brandon Lee? So it turns out his real name is Brian McKinnon, and he'd been at that school as a kid. So he'd gone back to the same school that taught him, and teachers who taught him originally were still teaching him the second round, and no bells were rung and all this kind of stuff. It's an incredible story. But the film's incredible as well because he's interviewed for the film, but he doesn't want to be on screen. So Alan Cummings lip syncs all the interviews that go for it, and he does it brilliantly. I mean, it's such a restrained and subtle performance because that's how the voice is. It's quite odd. He's got this transatlantic twang. He said he was from Canada, even though he wasn't. He was from Bearsden, you know. And it's such a weird story. And because McLeod's his classmate, all the other interviews with classmates are so relaxed and revealing, you know. And some of them are really heartbreaking. There was a woman who was in the school play with him, South Pacific, and they were the 2 leads. And her memory was that when they had to kiss, it was just, he barely kissed me, it was like a peck on the cheek. But they find footage of this, and it's a proper snog. I mean, and she's really quite upset by this because of the circumstances that then unfold. So it's that weird thing about if you made a film like this and it was a fictional film, you'd think, nah, no chance, it would never happen. But yet it did happen. And it was probably my film of the year in a weird way, because I did know the story and getting to hear exactly how it happened. Because when he walked in on the first day, kids were like that, that's a man. You know, they thought he was the student teacher. And when he sat down with them, they were like, what's going on here? And yet the other teachers, you know, loved him because he was very polite. And because he was in his 30s, of course he was. And but they never, no problems flashed up. And it was only when he went on holiday with 3 other girls that were in his class that he kind of said to them, actually, I'm 30 odd and this is my real name. And, you know, and the reason he said he did it, I kind of believe it was because he wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to study medicine, and he dropped out when he was young the first time round, and for various reasons had to work other jobs. And then by the time, I don't know if it's still this way, but in Scotland, if you're over 30, you couldn't study medicine. You couldn't go to university to do medicine at that time anyway. So that's why he went back to the school to get his A-levels, or his higher as it would be, to go and do medicine yet again. But of course, it all fell apart, and then the news were on it, and just an astonishing story. And yeah, but a true one at that. It's an amazing film.
That is wild. I have so many questions, and I'm like, I'll just watch the film because we could be here for hours.
Yeah, because a lot of it's anime, all the stuff from from his life at school when he was younger is all animated, things like that, you know.
It is interesting as well.
He was driving him around when he was like, you know, they were like, what are you doing driving a car? And he went, oh, I got my thing in Canada. You can be younger in Canada and get your license. Just the lies just tripped off his tongue. He says his gran had died and that's why he needed time off school. Not only was his gran alive, his gran was actually his mum. And all these people had gone and kind of been in his house and she was going along with it. You know, she was, it was just, it's so odd, but it's, the real joy of it actually is the stuff between the old schoolmates and the reminiscing of their school days with this kind of endearing character to them, to a lot of them. You know, he was a pal and he stood up for them and all sorts of things. But yeah, of course he was mature for his age because he was 32.
I think it's really striking as well, just hearing you talk about that, about like, you know, one thing that I noticed, although I didn't see the film, like it was a huge hit at like the GFT and that, like it did so well. They kept it on for like 3 weeks. It was sold out screenings more often than not. I think they brought it back for even a wee while after that. Like people just could not get enough of it. And I think it's really testament to how like if you give people like a story with a good hook like that in an environment that they recognize, you know, then people will turn out for it. You know, it was the same. Like I went to the film festival this year. I went to the 20th anniversary screening of the Sweet 16, a Ken Loach film, and like the number of people at that screening that you would never usually expect to find in the GFT, who you could hear overhearing people who had like a working knowledge of the filmography of Ken Loach, just because, you know, he consistently makes stories that represent them and put them on screen, and like people appreciate stuff like that. You know, people turn out for it. And I think that's maybe something that gets forgotten a lot of the time in terms of like, you know, making films for like wide audiences in particular regions, you know, and the value of that and how like people will be loyal to that kind of thing and stand by it and actually support it.
Because people that would remember that story would say, oh, I remember that, and then go in to see it for that reason. And apparently when that Sinking Feeling was being sold on DVD with the BFI version, I think, it was their biggest selling DVD of that year, and 70% of the sales were Glasgow. You know, so that's exactly what you're saying, Chris. What about your next choice?
I guess I'll just go chronologically for the rest of them, since I've got my favorite one out of the way. So this was one we were saying before we started recording, Ali, like when you talk about like not remembering what was this year and what wasn't, this was one that came out, I think I saw it in previews between Christmas and New Year last year, and then it officially opened here on New Year's Day. So you're really talking like right after we recorded last year. But Licorice Pizza, the latest Paul Thomas Anderson film, obviously a stalwart of these end of year recordings for us. All big Phantom Thread fans, I seem to remember. And before that, The Master and Inherent Vice and so on and so forth. So this is his latest one. Again, it's kind of like, it's not really autobiographical because he would have been younger at the time in the characters that he portrays in the film, but it's set in 70s LA, and it's kind of, I guess, maybe kind of in a similar style to what Tarantino did with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, at least for a long stretch of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where it is more just kind of about capturing like the vibe of the time, and it's kind of like a hangout movie. It's not really, there's not really a propulsive plot driving it forward or anything. It's just about spending time with the characters as they kind of go from one situation to another. And it stars Alana Haim from the band Haim as Alana Kane. So a kind of, I guess, like a 70s-fied version of herself, or not too far removed from herself. Her sisters are played by her sisters and bandmates in Haim. Their parents are played by their actual parents. And she's in her mid-20s, and I guess kind of similar to like The Worst Person in the World, kind of having that kind of mild identity crisis of like, I don't really know what I'm doing with my life. She's drifting through a series of jobs. She's as the film opens, she's working for a high school photographer where she meets a like strikingly self-assured 15-year-old called Gary Valentine, who is played by Cooper Hoffman, son of Philip Seymour Hoffman, himself obviously a veteran of the Paul Thomas Anderson Repertory Company, who tells him that he's a child actor and he's an entrepreneur and he has all this stuff going on in the background. She's kind of fascinated by him, and he asks her out and she's like, no, I'm 25 and you're 15. No, it's not happening. But she's kind of fascinated enough by him to be friends with him and kind of continue to hang out with him, just try and figure him out. And it just kind of follows them through like a few months in early 70s LA. And it is kind of, part of it is kind of like that kind of Dazed and Confused style period piece where it's all very amiable and hanging out. But I remember the first time I saw it, I came out of it and I was like, why am I so tense in the chest? Like nothing bad actually happens to these people all the way through it. It's all about all their kind of like all the kind of obstacles to their well-being are all very minor in the grand scheme of things, but there's just some kind of subconscious like anxiety rumbling through it, I think, just kind of these wee kind of discordant notes around the edges that kind of captured how, I guess, kind of the weirdness of that time in your life, where you're trying to figure yourself out and your place in the world and that. And it kind of, there's nothing overt, but just these very kind of subliminal kind of notes of discord all the way through it. But it plays really nicely with like the interplay of fact and fiction as well. There's a lot of people playing like actual people from that kind of era in LA, and a few who are also like kind of composites. So like Sean Penn shows up as a composite of a couple of actors, most notably William Holden, who plays a version of William Holden called I think Jack Holden, I think his name is in it. And Tom Waits shows up as a director, or Rex Blau, fantastic name for anybody who would be played by Tom Waits. Has one of the shots of the year. His entrance is incredible. He's like backlit. There's like plumes of cigarette smoke around him. He's just the silhouette, very recognizable outline of Tom Waits. But you also have people playing, real life figures like Bradley Cooper is in it as John Peters, the Hollywood celebrity hairdresser who inspired shampoo with Warren Beatty, and was the boyfriend of Barbra Streisand at the time, and then went on to a career producing movies. I think he's still working to this day. You have Benny Safdie, who is one of the Safdie brothers who directed Uncut Gems and Good Time, as Joe Wax, who is one of the longest serving city council members in LA history. He's on his first mayoral race in this. Alana gets caught up in kind of his mayoral campaign. It's a very charming film, I think, but maybe not the unambiguous Good Time kind of that a lot of people maybe took it as. I think the problem with it is that, or not the problem with the film, but maybe with the way that a lot of people read it, is that taking it as like Cooper Hoffman's story rather than Alana Haim's.
Yeah, I think that's what I was going to ask.
If you read it from a 15-year-old boy's point of view, then it's a very wish fulfillment, like, oh, I'm going out with a 25-year-old kind of thing, or I'm trying to go out with a 25-year-old, just tolerating my efforts up to a point. But I don't think that's the film that was actually made. I think it's mostly meant to be seen from Alana's point of view, and it's more a kind of, is she going to be stuck in this kind of endless cycle of like going from one degrading job to the next, like dead end relationships and all this kind of thing, one date that doesn't work out after another, or is she actually going to move on with her life? And it comes to a quite bleak conclusion on that front if you read it from that point of view. Like the title Licorice Pizza refers to a kind of chain of LA record shops, because a record looks like a licorice pizza. And if you want to take that and run with it, like it's almost like she's stuck in the run out groove, it's like, and she's looking for a way to like lift the needle on the record and flip the side over to really torture the metaphor. And as the film concludes, she's still stuck in that run out groove. She's arguably just going back to the start of the same side. It's really not a happy ending for her. Despite maybe outward appearances. It's one where if you kind of stop and think about it for a couple of minutes, you're like, oh no, this isn't going to go well, So I think it's more complicated and more complex than I think it was maybe given a lot of initial credit for. It's definitely not just the kind of like, hey, it's the first half of Boogie Nights with none of the downfall. It's
that's interesting, because I think, having looked at the trailer, I thought it was his story rather than hers, and that makes me want to watch it more than maybe I did previously, so I think I'll do that.
Yeah, she's great as well. It's worth pointing out it's her first kind of role in a film, and she's absolutely so charismatic, such a knockout, such a real kind of natural on screen. Really, really can't speak highly enough of her. And the dynamic with her actual sisters is great as well. They're really fantastic, just really deadpan comic timing. You can tell, like, obviously they've spent so long playing on stage with each other at this point that they just have that really natural chemistry. And obviously being sisters, I say that as if like they've picked this up on the road or something, and they haven't spent like 35 years living together or whatever. But it's just very natural, and it's a very adroit piece of casting. I think like it's something that basically came about from Paul Thomas Anderson having directed a bunch of music videos for them, and him kind of seeing something in her and wanting to kind of build a vehicle around her. And you can tell it's very lovingly done, I think. But yeah, really great showcase for her.
Wesley, what's your second choice?
Good question, Ali. Good question. I think go for a little kind of short one that I watched recently that was very pleasant in an odd way. I think It was something I watched at the start of this month. It was called Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy.
Right.
And if I can just very briefly describe how it made me feel, I think it was basically just like a big, warm, embracing, existential hug of a film. To really describe and it's not the type of film that you can really describe by plot or anything, but what it is it's an anthology of three vignettes, if you like, following three different women predominantly, which are completely unrelated in story, but they are very much linked or united tonally by themes of fate or happenstance, however you want to look at it. One story involves maybe like misplaced love. Another story involves like a honey trap that goes wrong. Another story involves like a really chance mistaken identity kind of meeting. And they're all really linked by these themes, although they, as I said, do explore lots of different things individually amongst those stories. I'm sure I read somewhere, I can't remember, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, so I might get this completely wrong, but I think the Japanese title of it translates as coincidence and imagination, maybe.
Right.
So that, if true, then obviously feeds into those themes a little bit more as well. There's probably not much to look at in terms of the way it looks. It's quite a sparse film, at least the cinematography is quite sparse. And the conversations, it's a very wordy film from start to finish. And it's conversationally led. And the conversations on the surface, I think, seem very ordinary. It's obviously subtitled, so you need to pay attention to it, but you can still switch off a little bit if you don't kind of give it enough of your attention. But when you start to kind of lean closer into it, you can find yourself, or at least I did find myself, really sort of hypnotized by the kind of tranquil humanity at the heart of all of these stories. It's a really fascinating little film, and all those intimate conversations I was talking about, they're all just like full of really little small nuggets of wisdom. But they also dip their toes into kind of bit of absurdist humor at times as well, which is quite interesting. And it's made and written by a director who most people will probably know by now, called Ryuzuki Hamaguchi, who I was completely unaware of because I have not seen the film that he directed that was given loads of plaudits, which was Drive My Car, which I think was a favourite of yours, Chris, last year.
Yeah, I really like Drive My Car. I think I talked about it on last year's podcast.
Yeah, and I was completely unaware of this. I just came across this film, thought I'd throw it on a movie, watched it, and was like, after looking it up, was like, oh, okay, it's the guy that did Drive My Car, the film that I really wanted to see, but couldn't bring myself to sit in the cinema for 3.5 hours or whatever the length was. But I just kind of came away from it thinking, is this guy like an absolute master of dialogue? Because the dialogue was incredible throughout it. It was really poetic, really lyrical, but it was poetic, it was lyrical, it was touching on all these human notions in a really short and snappy way, but it did it all without ever disappearing up its own arse. And to be quite honest, I think that's a talent in and of itself. So yeah, I think you've maybe seen this, Chris. If you have, I'd be interested to see how you think that compares to Drive My Car in terms of tone and theme, because obviously I've not seen that. This is my first film of his.
Yeah, I really liked it. I've seen a few Hamaguchis as well, and like you think Drive My Car is long, like he also has one called Happy Hour, which is 5 hours long, which I did on a bank holiday Monday this year in one go. So yes, I would say, yeah, Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy feels a lot kind of lighter to me than Drive My Car. Like Drive My Car is very much about someone kind of working through grief and all this kind of stuff, and is I guess just as a function of like being split into 3 shorter stories, there's nothing as kind of, I don't want to say suffocating about Driving My Car, because it's a great film, and I think everybody should, anybody who is the slightest bit interested in it should check it out. But it feels kind of like I think he made it. They actually came out initially both last year. He made them kind of like immediately one after the other, and I can't remember what order they were in, or if it was maybe, I think was Drive My Car maybe shut down by kind of lockdown or something like this, and this was something that he did just as a kind of exercise in between shoots or something like that. I think I heard something like that, and it feels much kind of lighter and more freewheeling, I think, than Drive My Car. I mean, obviously there is still some kind of like weighty stuff kind of dealt with within it, but you're certainly not getting anything that is as kind of lighthearted as the kind of the final segment in this one, with the 2 women kind of reuniting after a long time and then mistaken identities and all this kind of thing. You're not getting anything like that in Drive My Car. I think like the middle story in this one is great. I think that's potentially like one of this kind of scenes of the year is just this kind of one-on-one between like a college professor and student, and it's really well handled. It doesn't necessarily go the ways that you would expect it to go given the kind of setup of it. And again, it's something that I liked. I was going to say this about Worst Person in the World as well. I like that we are beginning to see films like that actually do kind of play with a lot of very contemporary concerns, because I think a lot of the time films are kind of maybe afraid, maybe because of how long it takes to make a film now and get funding and all that kind of, you're worried by the time that something comes out that it'll be dated already. But it's been nice to see films this year that actually do engage like directly with kind of the issues of the day, or however you want to put it. And like, yeah, that felt like a very direct address to like kind of Me Too kind of stuff, and kind of the kind of like kind of knottier, kind of thornier issues around it, in the same way that like, the Worst Person in the World did it directly as well, with like the stuff on like cancel culture, and like there's a chapter that in Worst Person in the World that directly references Me Too, right? It has like Me Too, and it's like the hashtag is in the chapter title. So yeah, it's nice to see like stuff like that where it actually feels like it is, oh yeah, this has been made within the last couple of years. This is stuff that's actually directly relevant to stuff that's happening now, and it's not necessarily concerned with like timelessness or anything like that. It will be a nice time capsule in years to come. But yeah, no, it's thoroughly recommend it. I really liked Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy as well.
Well, my next choice doesn't concern the modern guns of today, because it is The Hermit of Traig. It was shot over 10 years, I think, kind of almost 3 years to get it set up for him to agree to allow the filmmaker, Lizzie McKenzie, to do it and to stay with him and shoot him and all of these kind of things. I think what I might do is cheat a little bit and read you a bit of the synopsis, because otherwise I would just be rambling to explain what the thing is about. A meticulous diarist and an avid photographer, Ken Smith has spent the past 4 decades in the Scottish Highlands, living alone in a log cabin near Loch Traig, known as the Lonely Loch. He has no electricity or running water. He lives off the land, fishing for his supper, chopping wood, and even brewing his own tipple. Filmed over 10 years, director Lizzie McKenzie captures Ken's profound spiritual relationship with the wilderness. And it's an amazing film. It's beautiful shot, but then I kind of think with that, to work with the landscape and everything, you would struggle not to make it beautiful. It's about his relationship with nature and about man's relationship with nature as well, but it's also about aging, and particularly he's in his 70s, so if he's been there 4 decades, you have got the kind of young wood chopper, catching fish with his teeth and all that. You can imagine the young man up there. And then you've got this guy in his 70s who's beginning to become frail, and he has to go to hospital, for instance, for a couple of times. So he does start to rely on others, and he has to rely on others. And I think Lizzie filming him also becomes his friend and not carer. I wouldn't go as far as that, but certainly, is caring for him and cares about him. I mean, he's a fascinating character, charismatic in his own way, absolutely. And he's not someone that you think, well, he's been out of the way, so he absolutely knows nothing. He just knows what he wants to do and where he wants to be, and completely happy on his own and doing all the things he's doing. There's people that kind of help him out when he needs it throughout his life, but it's becoming clear as the film progresses and as we get to know him that he is going to need more help from others, and that's the kind of sad part of it. Although I do believe he attended the Glasgow Film Festival showing, which I think was his first time, in the big city for many, many, many years, and it won the Audience Award at the film festival as well this year, which I think is telling too. I was really moved by it, not just the way it was shot, but moved by this whole idea. Maybe it's just me aging as well. About aging, it really felt there was some kind of real, as the seasons change and as he's changing constantly, but they are renewing themselves, but he isn't. He's kind of only going in one direction. And there's something quite kind of moving about that. I think kind of poetic about that too. And I think Lizzie McKenzie really does capture, not just the character, but the whole situation that he kind of desires to be in. Do either of you seen it?
No, it's been on my list. Yeah, I remember seeing, as you said, him attending the festival, and that really sort of stuck with me and made me kind of want to watch that a lot more as well, because the story around it sounds incredible. But yeah, I've not had the chance to see it yet, unfortunately.
I think it might be on iPlayer, maybe not, but it certainly was shown on BBC Scotland during the year. We've done 45 minutes and only 2 films each, so we'll just crank it up. Chris, what's your next film?
Okay, well, this is a kind of handbrake turn from The Hermit of Trig, but my favorite kind of blockbuster of the year by some distance was Nope, Jordan Peele's third film. I guess we can call it a blockbuster. It was released at the height of the summer season and had, like, you know, the big full PR rollout for all that, but it is a very weird film by blockbuster standards. Like, it really takes its time getting going. There's a lot of digressions. It doesn't really reveal what it's about until, like, you know, a sizable way in, and it really kind of relies on the audience's patience. But I really appreciated that about it. I think it is something that is proven quite divisive. I went with like 2 others, and we ran the gamut from one hated it, one thought it was fine, and I loved it, you know. So it really is I think it has split reactions, but it's just been fascinating to watch Jordan Peele kind of grow as a filmmaker in the last few years, because obviously he started out as a comedian, a sketch comic, you know, with Key and Peele and stuff, and then Get Out was such a massive cultural phenomenon, you know, like it was just such a you know, critical success, commercial success, just a cultural touchstone for, like, you know, so much other stuff in years to come. And it's just, yeah, as he's gone on, he's kind of allowed himself to get a little bit kind of freer and a little bit, you know, woolier and a little bit kind of more like experimental and exploratory with his ideas, because Get Out is so kind of like tightly controlled, you know. It's like this, every single detail like means something, you know, but almost to the point that where you can go back and rewatch it, but you're kind of getting the same thing from it every time. You might notice little details like, oh, when he's picking cotton, you know, in the armchair to keep himself alive, you know, there's a metaphor there, all that kind of stuff. I think the pleasures in rewatching stuff like that is when it's more open to interpretation. So like I've kind of always preferred Us to Get Out because of that, because it's like its metaphor isn't as like strictly tethered to, no pun intended for us, but it's not as strictly tethered to like one idea, you know, like the kind of the tethered in Us could be, you know, any societal issue you care to point at. And Nope kind of takes that even further. There's just so much going on with it. You know, it's about the erasure of Black artistry from cinema history. It's about like the society of spectacle. It's about the exploitation of child actors and animal actors, if you can even call animals actors at any point. It's arguably about the transition from like analog to digital. It's like there's just so much going on in it, and it really kind of takes its time like exploring all of that fully. It's about a family of Black horse trainers who live on a ranch in California. Their horses have been used in films throughout film history. They claim that one of their ancestors is the jockey in the Edward Muybridge film, very early film of a Black rider on a horse. Yep. And something weird is happening in the skies around their ranch, and they come to realize that there's some sort of UFO lurking in the clouds, but it's not quite as straightforward as that, and it turns out it's not actually a UFO craft, but the thing itself is an animal of sorts, some kind of predator, and when it abducts people, it's eating them. Like it actually has kind of jaws and teeth, and you kind of see this happen at one point in one pretty disturbing sequence. You know, you see like a POV shot from inside the alien of people basically being taken in and eaten by it. But around this, it spins all these stories about, like, you know, there's a former child star who now runs like a really tacky cowboy ranch, who survived a chimp attack on set. Like it was a set where they had a chimp actor and the chimp went crazy and like bit off someone's face and stuff like this. But you know, all this kind of stuff. There's all stuff about like bad miracles. There's it opens with a quote from like the Book of Nahum, I think, like the biblical book of. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And yeah, there's just so much going on with it. There's so much to digest and so much to take in, and I can see why people wouldn't like it, because it doesn't really come close to your traditional satisfactory payoffs in a lot of ways. You know, it really takes its time getting where it's going. It's about 2 hours 20 minutes, and that's really just working through its ideas. That's not like, you know, we're going to have action scene after action scene. There's going to be, you know, like payoff after payoff after payoff. It's not, you know, it's really like it wants you to think about what it's doing. You know, it's kind of almost been Trojan horsed into the form of a summer blockbuster. You know, he's really got a lot on his mind, and I think this is a very reductive way to describe it, but it reminded me of, you know, the Simpsons Halloween episode with the segment. It's called like Attack of the 50-Foot Eyesores. And it's where the advertising hoardings come to life, and they realize that the only way they can get around it is to tell people not to look at them. So they get Paul Anka in to write a jingle, called "Just Don't Look," and it's basically that basic idea blown up to like a grand scale. It's like this kind of like, the only way we're going to get around this is if you don't look at it, and you can read into that however you want. If like, it's a commentary from Peele on like the state of the industry, like anything that you don't like in modern cinema is only going to go away if you just stop paying attention to it. All this kind of stuff. So there's a lot that you can read into it. But yeah, I think it's one. I've only seen it once. I'm desperate to see it again. I think it will really reward repeat viewings, and I'm very excited to see what he does next.
Excellent. And it wouldn't be a film podcast without Chris putting a reference to The Simpsons in it. Somewhere along the line.
It wouldn't be a day in my life without me putting a reference to The Simpsons in it.
Wesley, what's your next one?
Since we're talking about blockbusters, then I'll stick with the theme. It's not exclusively a blockbuster; it has a blockbuster feel to it. Could you say it's a mid-budget film? I don't know the finances of it, but maybe it was. But it definitely, aims for the sky in terms of making it feel like a blockbuster film. And it's Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I only watched 2 days ago, actually. Totally missed all the discourse around it. I watched it a couple of days ago.
I wish I missed all the discourse around it.
Yeah, exactly. That's happened for quite a lot of films this year, including Licorice Pizza, which I'm glad I also missed the discourse around. But yeah, part of me thinks that this film, I will start it off by saying part of me thinks this film will age terribly. It really will. It's overstuffed with like all this visual imagery and super quick edits that I feel is really like dialed in to appeal directly to the sort of smartphone generation, if you like. And I also can't help that at times, but feel like at times it comes off as a little insincere. But what I would be saying is I'd be completely lying if I didn't say that, if I said I didn't completely enjoy the ride of it, because I did enjoy the experience of watching it. And I think it's a really interesting film from this year to talk about. How to put it? I mean, in terms of the blockbuster element of it, at the risk of sounding like Harry Styles, this is the most movie a movie can actually get. Ali, please do not clip and quote that out of context.
No, I won't do that.
It made me, what I mean by that is when I watched it from my couch on Thursday night, it really did make me want to rush out to like the nearest Dolby cinema and just soak up every inch of like all the chaotically engineered visuals and the finely tuned sound design. And it was just an exhilarating experience. And yeah, it's definitely one of those ones I feel like I was going to say I wish it would be the film that was trying to get people back into cinemas again, but I think it did not bad considering the budget anyway. I think it was pretty, A24 was one of the most successful films, so that's quite impressive. But it's one of those films, again, like a few of the ones I've talked about, you should definitely go into this one knowing absolutely nothing about it, so I won't get any of the details of the plot itself, but it is bursting at the seams with lots of different invention, and it does span kind of multiple different genres, and it's all multiverse related, which is not something that really appeals to me generally as a storyline, but there's a bit of clunky exposition to get to the point. Some of it feels a little bit repetitive, but what I find most interesting about it is the way that it takes a very 2022 approach, a very maximalist approach, if you like, to something that is a kind of deeply tender story about intergenerational trauma, and a story that's very specific to the immigrant experience. Now, obviously, that is like something that I'm bringing up really because I think it's a perfect example of a film that can have mass appeal in a big screen, in a sort of popcorn munching way, but will also completely resonate on a really much deeper level with those specific audiences that can connect to its central themes that obviously I can't specifically do. And while they're very, very different in a number of ways, and I wouldn't say they're the same film at all, but the sort of core theme of the intergenerational immigrant experience that I can't personally speak to, specifically the story of a complex relationship between a mother and a daughter in that environment. I couldn't help but think of another film that I really enjoyed this year, which was Turning Red, the animated film that Disney put out. And the reason I think of that is because I think to how Disney completely done it dirty by sending it straight to streaming, while putting things like Lightyear on a big theatrical release, for example. So very interesting film, didn't work for me on all levels. Don't know how it would hold up in a rewatch for me. So I think I might just leave it where it is. But I think we really need more stories like this, with mainstream appeal being given the chance to succeed in cinemas. And I'm really glad that that's an example of that, even if I am sort of still on the fence about my overall feelings on it.
Chris, have you seen it? Were you?
No, I haven't. But I have seen plenty of other Michelle Yeoh films, and I can heartily recommend it.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say other multiverse films, but I guess you probably
No.
Well,
I did actually. No, I'll let you go, Ali. Never mind. I was going to go off on a tangent. We don't have time. On you go.
Well, I'm going to talk blockbuster as well, and this was a film I think that got people back into cinemas, and it is Batman. Is it The Batman?
The Batman.
It's the definite article, isn't it? And it's the emo Batman, definitely. You know, this is the one that listens to Nirvana and yeah. But I actually think Robert Kilpatrick. That's who it was, isn't it?
Robert Pattinson.
Robert Kilpatrick. Who the hell's that? Robert Pattinson. I think he plays it quite well. I prefer it to the kind of middle-aged spread of Ben Affleck's Batman. But it's not, it's not Christian Bale, I would say. I'm claiming it a little bit as a Scottish film because loads of it was shot in Glasgow, as we know. Very dark film. I mean, literally a very dark film. It was difficult to see what the hell was going on at times. Lots of, I enjoyed it. It was the one that got me back in a kind of multiplex cinema seat, that you could lay back in and all of that stuff. Went with a couple of pals to watch it. Exactly that kind of film. But really, I wanted to talk about it mainly because of that thing about getting people back into cinema and the kind of challenges that they face. So you've got this huge release that was kind of everywhere, and I think probably did okay. I don't know how well it did, but it does seem that it's still a struggle to get people back to cinema. What do you think?
Yeah, I think by and large, you're probably right, but there have been counter examples this year that have been really strong. I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind is Top Gun. Like, I don't think anybody could have predicted. I mean, never write off Tom Cruise, I guess, but like, just the sheer popularity of that, like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, like, Top Gun is has a place in people's hearts out of like nostalgia and stuff. But even now, if you look at like,
not a good film.
Not that I'm taking IMDb ratings as the be all end all, but the original Top Gun has like somewhere between a 6 and a 7, I think, on audience ratings, and the new one is like in their top 250. Like, it's properly like people went nuts for it. People loved it, and I also really enjoyed it. I mean, like, I'm not going to wholeheartedly endorse it by putting it in the top 5 because it's still a piece of like military propaganda. It's just a very well done piece of military propaganda, and like it works. It plays an audience like a fiddle. I went and saw it on opening night in IMAX, and it was sold out. And talk about like an all ages crowd. Like, I was between like two people probably my parents' age on one side and a group of teenage girls on the other side, and everybody was like gasping all the way through it, and it absolutely worked at every single level. It's a very kind of muscular piece of old school filmmaking. It feels weird to call like Top Gun old school filmmaking at this point, but it does feel like a relic of a system that's not really in place anymore. Hollywood doesn't really do stuff like that with a lot of like physical stunt work, and you're seeing every bit of the money that they spend on it up on screen kind of thing. So much is now put in CG, and we're going to shoot this on green screen in like a car park in Atlanta or something like this, rather than actually going out and showing you something spectacular. And obviously Tom Cruise is a big part of that because he's found this like late in life commitment to, being a Jackie Chan style like showman. Like, no, you're going to know it's me doing all this. I'm probably going to die doing this someday, and you'll pay to see that too, But that and the other one that really stood out for me over the summer in terms of getting people back to cinemas, and maybe even more surprising than Top Gun for me, was Elvis. It felt like Elvis really hit a certain kind of niche, well, not even a niche because it was a wide audience, but it really felt like it hit something that had maybe been missing for a lot of people, and it became something that people said, oh no, you've got to go see this. I didn't like Elvis as much as I like Top Gun. I'm gonna be completely honest. Like, my tolerance for Baz Luhrmann has degraded as I've aged. But I can definitely see why people like embraced it and why it was as popular as it was. But the kind of thing for me is, okay, why just those two films then? Why is it those two in particular that have connected, and you're still seeing other cinemas kind of struggling and other films struggling? I mean, obviously we had the news this year about the film house closing, which is such a massive loss. And it's that way where you're like, well, what can we do? The genie's out of the bottle. People have become accustomed to like having everything available at their fingertips at home, to stream. Like TVs are getting better, sound systems are getting better. They're not anywhere near like a good cinema experience, but they're close enough for a lot of people. Kind of, I guess, in the same way that like, sure, the sound quality on Spotify is not great, but it's much more convenient than having like, records or CDs clogging up your living room.
System where everything's
clear.
Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. It's just so many people are like now kind of conditioned to expect convenience over like the actual quality of the presentation or something, that for a lot of people it'll be good enough just to wait a few weeks, especially now that the theatrical release window's collapsed as well, and stuff is going to be on streaming within like a month or two of it being out in cinemas. A lot of people are just like, well, why would I bother? Unless you have deep mental problems like me and you go like a couple of times a week still. But
I wonder if you were saying how you went to the GFT and it was sold out for Sweet 16, the kind of nostalgia. I wonder if Top Gun is a global version of that. Everyone kind of, even if they didn't go and see it back in the day, they know Top Gun. It's got scenes which have been nicked for other films and all that kind of stuff, and it's such a kind of cultural touchstone, even if it's not very good, that people went, oh yeah, I want to kind of return to those days rather than that film.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think we are like sort of entering this weird period of cinema, or re-entering this period of cinema as the experience again. And by experience, I mean capital EXPER continuous, because coming out of the pandemic, as I said, people's home, not everyone's able to do this obviously, but a lot of people have been able to upgrade their home system, as Chris said, into something that we can get amazing sound, amazing TV, like amazing quality on the TV, really create that cinema experience in the living room. It's never going to match it, of course it isn't, but for a lot of the major releases and even a lot of the big Hollywood ones, that's probably good enough for a lot of people. But you're getting these big experiences like Top Gun Maverick, which is a collective experience, I think, because of that nostalgia. Like Elvis, which is a bit of a strange one, but it's got that Baz Luhrmann-esque moment to it. It's a cultural moment, a Baz Luhrmann film, whether you like him or you don't.
And Elvis is still hugely popular.
And Elvis is still huge across so many different like age ranges, exactly. And now, I mean, you're looking at Avatar: The Way of Water. Like, I mean, like people are going back and sitting in a screen for what, 3 hours with 3D glasses on? Like what year is it?
15 minutes. I'm going tomorrow afternoon.
3 hours, 15 minutes. There you go, with 3D glasses on. I mean, when would you ever think that would be? So it's really starting to take hold in ways that mimic 15 years ago. But it's then what is suffering is the kind of smaller films again, as we're saying, and the reason that is, as Chris obviously pointed out, is that the limited theatrical window means that people are just waiting for, they're just being more choosy with their money, obviously, understandably, with the situation we're in at the moment. They're picking out those big experiences and then going back to, not Gregory's Girl, sorry, Sweet 16. I was speaking to a friend about this recently, not Sweet 16, but the kind of difference between why they go to the cinema and why they don't. And this friend's a really avid cinema goer. He goes all the time, and it's his happy place, and it still is. But he said he's been dialing back some of the new releases that he usually goes to see because he knows they've got the limited theatrical release. And what he's doing instead is he's going to see a lot more classic films, films that hold a place in his heart, that he can then sit in a room with other people, like many people, to watch it and really feel that sort of, again, experience in the cinema, something that you just wouldn't get at home when you just throw it on in the background because you've seen it 15 times or whatever it is. So it's like those two ends of the experience spectrum, if you like, but that whole swathe in the middle of films that they'll probably look fine on your TV are really suffering at the cinema. What the answer to it is, I've no idea, but it's definitely going off in different directions I didn't expect it to.
Interesting to see.
I think what's really fascinating as well is that even like somebody like Spielberg is suffering for it, who's like arguably the architect of like the big kind of event movie in ways, that I don't think are as bad as a lot of his harshest critics in the 70s and 80s made it out to be. I think Jaws is like such a really rich character piece in a way that is so completely divergent from what we would now recognize as like a summer blockbuster, but like The Fabelmans, his new film, which isn't coming out here until like the new year, like it's already on streaming in America. It's been out for like a month maybe in cinemas, and you think about it, it's insane. It's like a Steven Spielberg Oscar contender. It's like it's an end of year thing. In years gone by, that would have had like a massive rollout. It had been playing in cinemas for months, and it kind of bombed. and nobody really bothered going to see it. And it's like, I know Spielberg, I think Spielberg himself even kind of acknowledged this with Ready Player One a few years ago. I think that his kind of read on that material was kind of, this is the world I've created, and I've kind of now got to reckon with the consequences of that, you know. And it's like, if even Spielberg can't get a film, you know, in cinemas for more than a month, then what chance has anybody else got, you know? And unfortunately, that genie's out the bottle, and we just kind of got to try and figure out a way forward from here.
Very quickly before we move on to our next choices, have either of you seen Batman? The Batman?
Yes, I have.
No, you haven't.
I have
It's shaking his head.
No, as much as I would love to see like Paul Dano, Robert Pattinson, and Colin Farrell run about being weird with each other for 3 hours.
Very weird. By the way, very weird. That's a good point. I should have mentioned the villains are excellent in it.
Yeah. What do I think of it? I, as has been well documented on this podcast as well, but obviously overshadowed by Chris's like hatred of comic book adaptations. I'm not a big fan of that sort of stuff, but I am a big fan of Batman films, and always have been. I've always really liked Batman. I've always thought he's one of the most interesting sort of characters out there. And I've continued to think that. And I actually rewatched all of the significant Batman feature films this year in anticipation for the new one. And so you can kind of understand where my head's at with Batman. Batman Returns is absolute peak for me. Peak Batman for me, without a doubt. Rewatching the Nolan trilogy did not do it for me whatsoever.
Right.
Really had a lot of problems with it. But I also love Batman Forever, so sue me, I don't care.
Oh,
I love it because what I love about Batman is it's got those serious undertones, but it never, or usually up until the Nolan era, was never that afraid to take itself, like to poke fun at itself in a lot of ways. So when I hear this film, I'm like, hard-boiled, noir, emo Batman. Yes, sign me up. That's amazing. Definitely, I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
And it started off and it was great, but eventually it started to drag for me a little bit. And it's
too long. It's too long.
Yeah, it really is. And it felt a little self-serious at points, but comedic at others. And I just wished it leaned more into the absurdity of Batman. And it did at times, don't get me wrong. But if it really fully embraced how silly it was, I'd have loved it. But that said, the production design was out of this world. It was absolutely incredible. And as you said, Glasgow looked amazing in those scenes, especially towards the end of the film. So I'd like to revisit it again once to kind of, maybe next year or something. But
I'll watch it again,
yeah, but it was interesting. It looked amazing, and I love that emu Batman. I mean, who doesn't? That's great.
Right. Yes. Next choice, please.
Well, nice transition from Robert Pattinson. New David Cronenberg film came out this year, his first in 8 years, I think, since he worked with Robert Pattinson. His last one before his hiatus, Maps to the Stars, and then Cosmopolis before that. But this one doesn't have Pattinson in it. Crimes of the Future actually has Kristen Stewart in it, Pattinson's Twilight co-star, and they've both obviously taken very interesting career paths since then. Very like commendable to both of them for like swerving the pitfalls of that kind of post teen heartthrob franchise kind of era. They've done really well. They both turned out to be just incredible actors, like the pair of them. Kristen Stewart's kind of more of a supporting role in this one, so it's called Crimes of the Future. There's a very early Cronenberg feature also called Crimes of the Future, which has nothing to do with this. You must just like the ring of the title. It's kind of in the near future with in a world where like people have kind of evolved to not really feel pain as much. So surgery can just be carried out kind of in the open as a kind of quite casual thing. Viggo Mortensen and Lea Seydoux play a performance art couple. Viggo Mortensen's body has some kind of mutation where he grows new organs on his body, and their performance art is people watch Lea Seydoux cutting them off. So it's very Cronenbergian. It's like, you're not going to mistake this for a film by anybody else. I think there were like 4 or 5 different points in the film where I was like, this is the most Cronenbergy thing I've ever seen. And then something else would come along and I'd be like, no, this is the most Cronenbergy thing I've ever seen. Like, you can sum it up by like, I think Kristen Stewart has the line, but there's a line that they use in the trailer. And of course you would, because why wouldn't you? She says like, surgery is the new sex. And if you wanted to condense Cronenberg down into like 4 words, 5. I was right the first time. Like, that's it. There's so much like that in it. There's a guy whose like body is made like entirely of ears. He doesn't have any other features on his face, just loads of ears. There's a bit where Viggo Mortensen like gets a kind of cavity hauled out in his stomach and a zipper put on his belly, so Lea Seydoux can then perform some kind of oral sex on him. She kind of licks the body cavity. But it's actually like I'm saying all this as if it's just pure gross out like exploitation kind of all the way through. It's not. I mean, like Cronenberg's one of the best filmmakers in the world. I mean, obviously he started out in kind of like splattery kind of stuff, but as he's grown as a filmmaker, like he hasn't touched horror or sci-fi in like 20 years. Like the last kind of thing he did along these lines was Existence, which was like 1999. So he's coming to this with a lot to say. It actually weirdly reminded me of First Reformed in a way, which is my favorite film. I think 4 years ago now on the pod we talked about it, Paul Schrader's film about like climate change and how you reckon with it. And I think like that's stuff like that is on his mind here as well, because it ends up concerning like a kind of radical pro-evolutionary group who are trying to encourage humans to evolve in a way that lets them digest like plastics and toxic waste, and they subsist on that, so it becomes kind of part of that. And yeah, there's again just a lot going on. There's stuff about like kind of the value of art in a world like that. There's stuff about kind of religion, obviously, and cults and all political movements and all this kind of thing. But yeah, just great performances across the board. Obviously, Cronenberg, you're going to get some like really great imagery and ideas. And it ends with a shot that I think is probably a deliberate tribute to the Passion of Joan of Arc. It even goes to black and white and everything. This moment of transcendence with a look on Vigo's face with a single tear rolling down, and it's like that can only be a Joan of Arc reference. But yeah, loved it. It's absolutely like, you know, the King's back.
Excellent. That sounds like a lot going on there, but I must check that out. I'm a big fan of David Cronenberg. Wesley, what's your next choice?
Ali, you're going to have to put a disclaimer on this episode just for that plot description alone from Chris. But I definitely need to check that out. Cronenberg's somebody I really need to dive more into his filmography. Next for me is a complete opposite vibe from Cronenberg, and again goes back to what I was saying about not picking out, you know, what I think is ultimately are absolutely the best films of the year, but something that I wanted to talk about, which is the Banshees of Inisherin.
Right.
So I'm sure everybody will probably know anyway. You know, it's a film by Martin McDonagh, who is someone I have a very complicated relationship with. Not personally, obviously I don't know him personally. His filmography. I, like I'd imagine most people were first introduced to him through In Bruges. I was a huge fan of that when it came out. How well it holds up today is a discussion for another day probably, but it did make me really sort of excited to seek out his future work at the time. But his future work that came was, now remind me here, was Seven Psychopaths a Martin McDonagh film?
Yes.
It was, wasn't it? So Seven Psychopaths came out, which for me was a bit of a kind of middling disappointment, if you like. And then most recently before Inisherin was Three Billboards, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. So that Three Billboards was a film that, how do I put it, I deeply, deeply despised on so many levels. I just could not stand the film whatsoever. So when the buzz picked up around Banshees, I was kind of basically vowed to kind of stay clear of it, to be quite honest with you. Even though Brendan Gleeson is one of my all-time favourite actors, Colin Farrell is always a really interesting watch, whether he's playing in Batman or he's doing whatever it is, the kind of roles it is he's doing. But then my mum had texted me asking if I'd seen Banshees of Inisherin yet, and telling me how much she loved it. She was raving about it. So off the back of that, I decided to book tickets and shuffled along to the cinema kind of trepidatiously, I would say. And for the first 10 or 15 minutes, I was completely convinced this was just going to be another one of McDonagh's films where that was just going to rub me up the wrong way, to be honest. There was just all these whimsical stereotypes of rural Ireland, and they were just starting to grate on me a little bit. But then as it leaned further into absurdism, which I think is, I've kind of mentioned for a few films now, that must be the theme of this year for me, it started to become a little bit more introspective and affecting, and I realised that those kind of deliberate caricatures were actually there just to really be deconstructed. Now, what I'll say is that it's not to say I think it deconstructs all of the caricatures of Ireland pretty successfully. There's still some certainly questionable choices throughout it, but it was enough to start me to allow to connect with it more on an emotional level. So for anyone who doesn't really know what it's about already, it follows a breakdown of a relationship between two friends on a small rural Irish island that is so hard to say back to back, as one of the friends decides seemingly quite suddenly that he doesn't want to talk with the other one anymore. And that's as much as the plot will give you, because it goes off in a little bit of a different direction beyond that. What I will say is, though, that it does take part against the backdrop of the Irish Civil War, which is kind of left to simmer and bubble away in the background. Right. And I'm really glad that McDonagh made that choice to steer clear of integrating it into the wider story too much, because I took some moments from it that I thought were quite heavy-handed allegory that I didn't really enjoy as much, but apparently reading into it, that wasn't really on McDonagh's mind when making it. So I can only imagine how distracting and politically complex probably it would have been if he'd really leaned into it and tried to weave that into the film a lot more and waded into the kind of Irish Civil War elements of it. So he kind of leaves it where it should be, I think. Gleeson and Farrell are absolutely, as you would imagine, excellent in this film, but the supporting cast really elevates it, I think, and he breathes so much life into it, especially Colin Farrell's sister in the film, who's played by Kerry Condon. She's absolutely excellent. She gets a really, really good character arc, I think, which is unusual for a McDonagh film, I would say, to give a female character a good character arc. There was some really bad stuff with that in some of his previous films, but yeah, it was really interesting. In terms of who would enjoy it, I think, given that the audience that In Bruges has sort of found over the years, if you like, I don't think Banshees would maybe necessarily play as well with some of the subsections of that audience. It's not a big film, it's not a bold film, it's not brash, it's quite quiet in a lot of ways, but it's very dark. And I'm kind of fine with that though, because I think, while I don't think the film's perfect, I do think that it's a really kind of refreshingly mature companion piece to In Bruges in a way, and something that's really mature from McDonagh that really works to restore that sort of tonal imbalance, if you like, that's been really missing from his work, or at least his on-screen work, I think, for quite a while now. So yeah, I think maybe over time, depending on what I feel of In Bruges and a rewatch, I think I would maybe go as far out to say it's probably his best film to date. So yeah, very interesting film.
I will check that out, because when I heard about it, my first thought was it's the lost episode of Father Ted where Ted stops talking to Dougal.
Ali, that is literally how it's, honestly, it starts like that. And I was like, I can't watch this full film like this. But you start to move, you start to move beyond those kind of caricature elements a little bit, and it develops into something more darker in tone and in meaning, which is quite interesting. But yes, those caricatures really are at the forefront at the start of the film, and it put me off quite a bit, which is why I'm not fully sold on it. But yeah, interesting.
Chris, have you seen this film?
Yeah, I was also kind of like, it's good, but I'm not head over heels for it. Like, I think like a lot of the kind of, I think it's maybe being mischaracterized as a comedy a lot of the time is pretty tragic for a lot of it. And I think like we saw, was it opening night? It was definitely like a Friday night, and again, a very busy GFT. And I should say, when we're talking about cinema attendances, like the GFT has been stowed out this year, like consistently to a level that I don't really remember it being pre-pandemic.
On that as well, Banshees stuck around in the cinema for a long time down here, way longer than I think anyone anticipated it to.
Yeah, but I think part of that is to do with people just being fond of Irish stuff. And I think a lot of the laughs it was getting was like, they're Irish, they're naturally hilarious. And it's like, this is a tragic thing that is happening. I don't think it needs the belly laughs that it's getting, you know, like, so there's a lot of that for it. And I think like, I don't know. Yeah, like I'm kind of similar with McDonagh. I really liked In Bruges when it first came out. I haven't seen it since 2008, and I did not like Seven Psychopaths or Three Billboards at all. And I don't think he's quite back on the level with this one yet, but I think he is more in the right direction than he has been for a while.
That's interesting. Okay, my fourth choice is Martin Robertson's documentary Ride the Wave. You aware of that, about the 14-year-old surfer? So,
no.
14-year-old Ben Larg and his family live on the, God, I can't remember which island it is, but one of the islands up in Scotland. And he is a Scottish junior surfing champion when we meet them, you know, but he wants to go to what they call the big waves, and big waves should be in caps because these things are mad. And so it's about, well, ostensibly it's about him going to ride these big waves off the coast of Ireland, where the two of the biggest ones are. And but there's a real human story going on as well. It's really about his family. He's been bullied at school, probably because he's been sent here, there, and everywhere to take part in, you know, surfing contests and then coming back. So he ends up being homeschooled because he just can't. No, it's not happening at school. You've got this story really about the parents are both surfers. They run a surf school, so they really understand what's going on. And it's that kind of push and pull between wanting to protect their son yet wanting to let him fulfill his ambitions. And in this case, those are in the most opposite directions you can imagine. You know, we want to keep him safe, but do we let him go and ride this huge wave? And you do not sugarcoat what can happen to people. There's a guy in a terrifically dry way who's kind of showing them videos. This is the waves that we ride, but this is what happens when someone breaks a femur, and there's a picture of the leg snapped and all the, and his poor mum in particular is really thinking, I really want him to go and be his own man and do this, but he's 14-year-old. And, you know, how do we approach this? So eventually, I'm not going to spoil what happens at the end, but they have to let him go and do what he needs to do, whatever the results of that might be. They need to step back and let him grow into the circle of other surfers who are all much, much older. This is a young surfer by quite a bit compared to the other people he's now kind of hoping to emulate and riding these big waves. There's little as cinematic as somebody on a surfboard on a big wave. That's just, you know, Big Wednesday, Point Break, whatever you want to think. It's a great thing to have on film, and this really doesn't disappoint. Yeah, but it's as I say, at its heart, it's the family dynamic and the family story, and it's about, again, growing up and growing out of that thing and how much you let your kids. I mean, some people will find it absolutely heartbreaking, I'm sure, because it's about letting your kids go at a certain point and just hoping that they'll be okay. And that's not like, oh, well, he wants to go to a gig on a Friday night in the Barras and I hope he'll be okay, as my mum might have thought when I was kind of that age. It's he's going out there, look at it, and trying to kind of get back safe. I should also say the music is by Scott Twynham, who's one of my favourite musicians. Scott was one of the original people in Looper, but he's gone on to do this incredibly cinematic, often piano-based short pieces. Really, really beautiful music, and I would buy this soundtrack. I think it is out on this as a soundtrack. And the music is just part of it. And Martin Robertson's filming is, again, a bit like the Hermit of Traig. It's difficult not to make these things look spectacular because nature at that level is spectacular. At that grand level that they're seeing this little people, and you go, oh, there's people out there, and there's times like that you just can't believe they're doing it. I mean, fuck that. Basically, I don't know where I am, but all fair play to them that want to do it. Is it a film either of you are aware of?
No, not at all.
I'd heard of it, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's really good. It's really, as I say, it's beautifully shot, and Ben himself is a teenage boy, so you've got the sulks and turning his cheek on his mum when she goes to kiss him and all that kind of stuff. You've got an old guy whose thing is, now you have to worry about the waves, but more than that, you have to worry about girls. This is in Ireland, this guy tells him. So there's lots of stuff like that. It's a very good film. Yeah, Ride the Wave. I would check it out. Chris, your final choice for this year.
I'm going to be cheeky here and do a quick rundown of what didn't make the slot, just because there's a lot. I deliberated over this for a while and agonized. So apologies to Memoria, Bread Factory, Red Rocket, Il Buco, Funny Pages, After Yang, and Armageddon Time. And if I was doing the whole Cahiers du Cinema, everything is cinema approach to these lists, then I would probably have put Nathan Fielder's The Rehearsal here, which was a 6-part HBO series and is one of the best things I saw all year in any medium. It's incredible, and check it out if you haven't seen it. I don't want to spoil it because it's best discovered on your own. But I'm going to go for White Noise.
Right.
In the final slot, which is Noah Baumbach's adaptation of Don DeLillo's landmark of postmodernism. I'm told I haven't actually read White Noise. I like DeLillo a lot, but that's one I haven't read. Like I devoured Underworld in the early days of lockdown, and I think it instantly became one of my all-time favorite books. But yeah, so I guess maybe that's the best way to approach this, because I don't have anything to compare it to, and I can't really gauge how well he's translated the tone of the book to the screen. But all I know is from watching it is like I really enjoyed what I saw. It's a kind of break from what's gone before for Noah Baumbach, because he's kind of best known for these kind of almost kind of like Woody Allen-y, kind of Whit Stillman-ish, kind of like low-key kind of character pieces, kind of often set in like New York or I guess LA lately as well. It's not that. It's like Netflix gave him a budget of about $120 million for this, if reports are to be believed, and every single penny of it is on screen. It ends up kind of somewhere between like Spielberg and Repo Man. It's this kind of satire of like 80s consumerism and like, I mean, where do you even start with what is satirizing? Like academia, like media, you know, like, you know, toxic waste and disasters that we're wreaking upon ourselves. Like there's just so much going on with it. And yeah, I had a blast with it. I thought it was really funny. Like it was maybe Baumbach's funniest film since Mistress America, which I think is maybe the single funniest film of the 2010s. Reunites him again with his off-screen partner, Greta Gerwig, who hasn't actually acted on screen in the film since about 2016 now, I think. She's been busy directing her own stuff. So it's great to see her again. She's paired with Adam Driver, who has also been in previous Baumbach films. They play a married couple who are each on their fourth marriage. It's set in 1984, I think, mid-80s certainly. And Adam Driver plays a professor of Hitler studies at the local college. He's kind of a fraud. He's not really able to speak any German. So, you know, he has all these kind of anxieties around this, and it's split into three sections, which from my research, the book also is. The first section is kind of just taking the tenor of day-to-day life and their kind of like environment, you know, this kind of like affluent middle-class American suburbia, you know, like he's lecturing through the day. She's developing an addiction to some kind of pharmaceuticals at home. You know, they spend a lot of time in the supermarket. You know, the shelves are all kind of is that Repo Man style, like, you know, nothing's branded. It's all kind of just written on kind of like cereal, soda, all that kind of stuff. But in the second half, or not the second half, the second section, there's what they refer to as the airborne toxic event, where a train crash unleashes a chemical spillage and everybody in their kind of locality is evacuated, and then it becomes a kind of like 80s Spielberg kind of thing. You know, there's lots of like people gazing at stuff off camera in wonder and fear and awe, and that's when you can really see the budget put to work. It's unlike anything Baumbach's ever done before. It's so packed of like visual invention, and like there's a lot of sight gags in it that couldn't possibly have come from the book, because no matter how good a writer Don DeLillo is, like it's not going to be as effective to be like, oh, a guy runs out in front of a car which stops and then runs him over anyway, you know, like that's not going to have the same kind of impact as actually seeing that happen on screen. And then yeah, in the third section it kind of shifts again to another, it's almost kind of like a trilogy of like interrelated stories, you know, with following this family through all of them. But yeah, I had an absolute blast with it. Again, you like talk about like putting the money on screen like Top Gun did. Like it's one of these ones that like I feel like a lot of filmmakers are doing this just now, where it's like we might never get a chance to make films of this scale ever again, so we might as well go out in style.
Yes,
You know, like there's a lot of that kind of like mid-level filmmaking that's not quite blockbuster style. Again, it's just mind-blowing to me that Netflix gave them the money for this. I don't know what they intended to get out of it, because like, and they've done it in increasing, like this is the third Noah Baumbach film in a row that they've funded. I don't know that Netflix's target audience are necessarily massive Noah Baumbach fans. Like it started with like the Meyerowitz stories, and then Marriage Story, obviously, and now this. And I don't know if they just think he's their shortcut to like award success or anything, you know, maybe something like this. But to give the man $120 million when he's never done anything like this in his life is really like, I've got no idea what was going on, but I'm glad it did.
I know the M word we try not to speak in terms of Marvel, but they started doing that a bit. They got like kind of indie directors and threw them into doing, and with very, very varied results, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing. It's like it's seen as like a shortcut to credibility, right? But then inevitably with Marvel, like Kevin Feige ends up having the final say on everything, so it still ends up just looking like every other Marvel film, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with those indie directors getting their paycheck and, you know, their name out there and moving on to something else. I mean, that's absolutely fine, no matter if I'm still not going to watch it, but it's good in that respect. But I had no idea about it. I saw this film sort of fell into my radar a little bit, and I saw it was Baumbach, and I thought, I kind of need to be in the mood to watch a Baumbach film. I had no idea it was as big a budget as that, and also anything. Like, if you described all that to me, I'd like, that's never a Baumbach film. That's really
it's wild. Like it's an absolute, again, like just a great one to see with a crowd. I mean, there wasn't a massive crowd. It was the start of this cold spell, so there was maybe a contrary to my previous statements, screen one of the GFT was not absolutely rammed for the opening night of White Noise. But I think it's one of these Netflix ones where it gets like a week run at the cinema, and then like it's going to be on Netflix, I think, before the end of the year. So I would say keep an eye out for it, and I would also say probably will lose something on the small screen just in terms of the sheer scale of it. But like I cannot believe it exists in the form that it does, and I'm glad it does. I think it will divide people. It's got a kind of tone that if you don't get on board with it right away, it's going to be a long 2.25 hours. But I just hit a real sweet spot for me. Just that kind of, you know, smart people doing very stupid things is exactly my kind of, you know, my preference when it comes to comedy, I think. So yeah, enjoyed it a lot.
For that, if it's coming to Netflix soon. Nice one. Wesley, what's your final choice?
So my final choice was just teed up really nicely by Chris in terms of people doing very stupid things. My final choice is actually Jackass Forever, believe it or not.
Masterpiece.
Masterpiece indeed. So this also, I mean, I said I wasn't going to do a lot from earlier in the year, but I don't think you really need to retain much from Jackass Forever to really be able to talk about it. But it also kind of paired with me going on a Jackass journey at the start of the year and the build up to it, which I am not ashamed to admit, and enjoyed every single minute of it. Jackass and everything that came with it, I think, for bad or good, better or worse, was an absolute like formative piece of art. I think that has totally shaped my life and the lives of so many people that I know. And if you think that's completely hyperbolic and ridiculous, then how about if I tell you that a series of films where guys frequently get their dicks out and administer the most unholiest of pain to areas of your body that you would never even want to think about happening to, then how about if I tell you my theory is that Jackass Forever is actually a really tender takedown of toxic masculinity and a really sort of loving portrait and profound tale about aging, because that is definitely what it is. I'm obviously not going to go deeply into everything about that, but if I've can sort of quickly break it down, I think growing up, for me at least, I never really felt quote unquote masculine. I had a very deep interest in a lot of certain things that society expected you know, a boy to like, if you like, such as, I don't know, football and whatever else, you know, action figures and Star Wars or whatever. But I was also really interested in pop culture toys and stories that would be really deemed as probably feminine, quote unquote. Now, obviously, I'm a you know, straight cisgendered man, so I'm not trying to say that this was like a really difficult part of my upbringing, because it wasn't. But I didn't skew one way or the other, as you really shouldn't, or shouldn't have to feel like you need to. And I never really gave it much thought either. But I started to slowly become aware as I got older that I wasn't fully accepted into what was kind of, you know, a more male-dominated environment a lot of the time. I never really felt comfortable in it. Mm-hmm. So growing up watching Jackass, you would think immediately that what people know about Jackass, you would think then that I would have felt really excluded from watching that as well, because it feels very testosterone driven, you know, male, heavy, like masculinity all over the place. And when I watched it when I was younger, I always felt that there was completely something different about it, something different about the bond that they had, and that they still share today as well. And throughout like the history of the Jackass franchise, if you like, bar a few maybe missteps here and there, it's always just been about guys or dudes, if you like, getting together, pushing their limits, and just like being really open and willing to be completely vulnerable around each other. And that's something that boys and men are just not conditioned into believing should ever be allowed, really. Yeah. But here they are, like, okay, mocking each other, of course they are, but they're looking out for each other as well. They're in on it together. They're not othering people. They weren't mocking women, for example, which a lot of things that tried to mimic Jackass at the time were doing. They weren't even really trying to up one another on the kind of masculinity stakes, because I think the joy that they find in the process, and what we kind of find as viewers, is all in basically, if you break it down a bit deeper, is how futile like bravado and exaggerated displays of masculinity is, when all of that can just be completely undone by a swift smack to the balls. And I mean, really, like, honestly, what is more beautiful than that? And I think Jackass Forever really continues that trend well, but with new faces. It has its first black crew members. It's got its first women to join the crew. And none of it feels tokenistic either, as it shouldn't. They just slot right in as they should be and are completely accepted, because the Jackass family is universal. And if you can't laugh at yourself, you can't be vulnerable around each other, and you can't look out for each other and support each other, then you're not good enough to be part of that world, which kind of flies in the face of what toxic masculinity is a lot of the time, at least on the surface. So it's great. I just loved it. I had such a good time. And it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ali, about aging, but it also makes me feel better about aging in a way, because this is third Jackass film I think I've now watched in the cinema, and it's opening week. One of which actually was the pinnacle of 3D cinema, which I'm not usually a fan of, but trying to dodge a giant golden dildo flying at your head was quite memorable, to say the least. But it's like a familiar comfort blanket when you watch it and you turn it on, despite them getting older. And it's also not afraid. Jackass Forever isn't afraid to really show those things that are changing, and to say that that's okay that things are changing and people are getting older. Their bodies might be getting weaker. They might be checking out of some of the stunts, but the joy and the bond that they've created together is like sort of everlasting. And I watched that with one of my best. I watched it with one of my best friends. She and I went in its opening week, chose the biggest screen in London that we could find to try and share the joy with like a packed cinema. As it turns out, I think we ended up picking one of the most expensive cinemas, and it was just us and three other people. But we still had the absolute best time watching it, just cackling away together without like a care in the world. And it just, I don't know, it just sums up a kind of cinematic experience, and an experience that's just really important to me. And it does it all in a way that just doesn't really harm that many people outside of their own crew who are all in on the joke. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of cinema, and it was great having that after a year of tense struggle during obviously the end of the kind of lockdowns last year.
I think it's really interesting because Jackass, to me, there has to be a level of trust with them and a lack of ego, those two things.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they'd be kicking the shit out of each other. It's not, there's an acceptance that we're all in this together. So leave everything at the door, and, you know, whatever happens, and we'll be happy for each other, you know, whatever, at the end of the day, when it's all done. It's kind of, people just enjoying the absurdity of themselves and of life in kind of general. And I think a good point is a lot of this TV that thought they were doing Jackass stuff afterwards was horrible, because it was just, and for a while, a lot of telly was like that. It was cruel, and it would mock and all of those things. And Jackass never did that. So that's a really good choice. Chris, are you a fan?
Yeah, like quite similar. It was like I grew up with Jackass. Like I was like probably 13, 14 when Jackass started, so it was exactly the right age for it. But yeah, you're right. Like none of its imitators ever came close, and like it's one of those things that you maybe don't even realize at the time why like Dirty Sanchez was such a massive pile of shit next to Jackass. But like you realize when you get older, oh, it's because they're all great pals. Like there's a warmth to Jackass. Like it's just these guys like kind of making themselves laugh. There's no intent to like humiliate other people or like go out their way to like, I mean, there were a couple of like hidden camera things in the original Jackass, and those were always like the weakest parts of it for me. The best things about Jackass were always just them trying to make each other laugh, you know. And it's really genuinely like heartwarming to see them all still friends. Well, minus Bam, but most of them still friends over, you know, like a couple of decades later, and they've aged together and they're all still like doing this, you know. I mean, like I guess you could make an argument. It's kind of like what I was saying with like Alana and Licorice Pizza, where oh well, they're still doing this 20 years later. They're still, you know, they're all
still loving it as well. They're still loving doing it.
Yeah, they're all happy doing it. Nobody seems to not want to be there, you know. And like, I mean, everybody is just so good natured, and like Johnny Knoxville is just it's one of the most naturally funny people, and like so charismatic, and like he's like the perfect ringleader for something like that. And you only need like one person like that and everybody else to be like good natured enough to go along with it for that something like that to work, you know. It was riotous. So I also saw opening night and loved it. Thought it was
glad we could share in the beauty of Jackass this year. Yeah. A beautiful Christmas gift to everyone.
It is, absolutely it is. Now, my final choice is really a TV series, but it was showing the whole thing at the Glasgow Film Festival, so I'm going to claim it as a movie. It's on iPlayer at the moment. It's Skint, which are 7 episodes long, of kind of standalone. They're kind of short 15-minute pieces. It's the star. There's one with Derry Girls, Saoirse Monica Jackson. We've got Michael Sosha, Emma Fryer, Gary Beadle, Isis Hainsworth, and Tamara Brabin. They're all central characters. There's writers involved. The writers are amazing, like Lisa McGee, Kerry Hudson, Jenny Fagan, Byron Vincent, and others. But the one I want to kind of focus on is The Taking of Balgrey Hill Street, which stars Peter Mullen as Donnie, and the writer is James Price. And it's, as I say, they're all kind of almost like one man, you know, or one person pieces, but there are some other characters involved. Mullen's great as this guy who really, the plot revolves around him wanting to get some curry sauce from the council food parcels without being caught doing so, and the kind of extraordinary lengths that he goes to for this thing. It's Mullen. It's almost like a Peter Mullen character, but written by Lemmy. There's a kind of absurdity to this guy as well. You know, I'm thinking about Dee Dee when I'm thinking about Lemmy characters. They're all brilliant. They're all worth seeing. It's a classic example of what can be done. One person, great writer, short amount at a time. Here's and it was all about. It's called Skint because everyone in it, you know, is struggling to make money and to make ends meet as well. That's the thing. They're in various different jobs, and there's all sorts of themes about pride, about having to deal with other people who are looking down upon you because of your social status, all of those things. But did either of you see Skint or any of Skint? Oh, did I freeze?
You did.
For how long?
Not long.
Right,
not
okay.
Like a few seconds.
Right, so what I was going to ask is if either of you saw Skint or any of them.
Yeah, I watched the whole thing, but it was mainly because of the Taking of Balgary Hill Street, because it's written and directed by James Price, who I talked about a couple of years ago. He wrote and directed Boys Night, which was one of my top 5 in 2020. I think it was a short film that he made, and yeah, I think he's one of the most exciting filmmakers in the country just now. I think he's just like he's the one to keep an eye on. Like I can't wait for him to like actually get a feature made, because he's so sharp like as a writer, and he's got such a great eye as a director as well, and he really kind of knows his stuff. And him being paired with Peter Mullen was such a kind of like, yeah, this makes so much sense. This is such a great combination of talent. I think the character is actually inspired by his dad. So I think a lot of it's kind of drawn from life. But yeah, it was great. I think that was like, yeah, Balgary Hill Street was far and away the standout for me. He also directed another one of them, the one with Michael Sosha, and it was also directed by James Price. But yeah, those two were like, yeah, but Balgary Hill Street in particular was a standout for me. Thought it was great.
Where can one watch this? Skint?
This is available. All episodes are available on iPlayer at the moment.
Great.
You can go and check them, and they are all worth seeing. But I would agree with you. I think that is a highlight. Yeah, just this man who's kind of wrestling with, no, I don't need any help, I'm okay, and then suddenly spying the actually some curry sauce for that might go quite well. It's just very, it's a great piece of 15-minute film, isn't it? It's a great short film, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, guys. Well, I was going to talk a little bit about telly, but I think we've given the people what they want, which is 15 recommendations.
And a lot of what they don't want.
And a lot of what they don't want, yeah. Thanks very much for doing this. It's great to see you both.
Yeah, you too. Pleasure, as always. One of my favourite times of the year.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it wouldn't be Christmas without it.
Nope.
And hopefully we can catch up soon in real life. That would be great.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the end of our Best of 2022 podcasts, but we will be back soon, probably in the new year, with someone completely different.